pretty regularly. All right, so what we're going to learn today is you're going to learn about what exactly are microformats. We're also going to be talking about semantic markup, which is sort of the foundation for microformats. Benefits of both. You can start publishing. Hello? Okay, how you can start publishing your content with microformats. I'm also going to demonstrate several tools that are consuming microformats that allow you to extract from your website. And I'll be providing you lots of resources so that you could actually go home today or back to work or whatever and start implementing them right away. And then lastly, I just want to address what HTML5 means for microformats. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be mentioning lots and lots of resources. You can find all of them in a big old list at this URL. That's FJ0, capital BPW. All right, so let's just start with the very basic question. What are microformats? They are not a specification from the W3C. They're actually a community-driven grassroots movement to try and add more semantic information to the web. This community of individuals who've forged ahead with creating microformats, they have a couple definitions. The first is that they're designed for humans first, machines second. They're open data formats built upon existing and widely adopted standards. Another definition is that they enable higher fidelity information on the web, publishing and sharing of that information. Some have called it smart content. Some refer to it as building blocks that allow users to control and move and share their data. And then markup with more meaning. Frankly, when I heard these definitions, I was still left with the question, what are microformats? Those are definitions that may make you sound smart, but they don't really tell you what formats are. This is my definition. At their very core, they're HTML attributes and values that are applied to a common web. To describe the is what Semantic is about. And so if you have a good foundation of HTML, you can start publishing microformats with a very, very short learning curve. And when I'm referring to HTML attributes and values, they're attributes that you're already familiar with. The class value, for example, that many people use for styling. Also, the rel value that is applied to links. These are all part of microformats. For example, this would be a link that I might have on with a blog post about CSS. This is a link to a tag on a blog post. Okay, so I wear this. 1 second. All right. Okay. Okay, I probably won't move much. Okay, so this is a tag that you might see on a blog post about CSS, a link to a tag. Many blog posts have tags on them. It's a common convention on the web. Well, there's a microformat that allows you to not only, you utilize it to explain what this tag actually is, what this link is. It's not just any link, it's a tag. And you do that with the addition of the rel attribute and a value called tag. And that's really the basics of what microformats are. It's this concept of using existing attributes and specific values to describe the content. We'll take a closer look at the rel tag microformat in a second. We have lots of microformats that we can work with to describe our content. The two most popular are hcalendar and hcard. They describe event and contact information respectively. And that's pretty common on the web. We also have rel license, which describes license links, such as what you might have if you have a Creative Commons license on your website. We also have XFN for describing social relationships on the web, vote links for indicating favor or lack of favor for a particular link. There's even a rel nofollow to discourage search engines from increasing page rank from a link. We also have draft microformats. As you can see from this list, we've got everything from HAtom for syndicated content like a blog to HRecipe for food and beverage recipes. We also have HResume, HNews, XFolk. The difference between a formal and a draft microformat is really just that formal microformats are pretty much finished in terms of the process of deciding that it's a microformat. I don't want to call it a specification because it isn't one, but just pretend I'm not saying specification. It's farther along in the specification process and kind of has had the stamp of approval, which means it's not going to have a lot of changes to it. Draft microformats are also kind of further along in the specification process, but they haven't been formalized and completely tested, so they are subject to some change. Now, in terms of whether I use a draft microformat or a formal microformat, I'm less concerned about whether it's formal and approved and subject to change than I am about whether I have the content that there is a microformat available to describe that content. It's not uncommon for us as developers and designers to utilize technologies that may not be as far along in terms of being widely adopted or even approved in the specification. I mean, how many of us are developing with HTML5? How many of us had been working with CSS3 well before the browsers caught up? So it's really just utilizing a microformat if you have the content for it. I'm less concerned about whether it's a formal or a draft. The only thing I will say that if you do choose to use a draft microformat, that you just make sure that you stay up to date on the news about that microformat. You make sure that you're aware of when changes are made. Okay, so microformats have a couple tenets to them. These are the basics of microformats, the sort of rules that the community has established that all microformats must adhere to. The first of which is that they use existing standards. So if you've developed prior to HTML5, they're going to utilize the class attribute, the rel attribute, the rev attribute. Oftentimes they can also use the title and ID attributes. With HTML5, rev is obsolete, so that's not included, but it's the same concept. We're using stuff that you already know. Additionally, microformats, the naming conventions that they come up for the values that you assign to each attribute, they're often based on technologies that have been well established. For example, the HCard microformat for contact information, all of the class values come directly from the vCard standard for electronic business cards. Those are those VCF files that people might attach to their emails that you can download directly to your address book. Same with HCalendar, the microformat for event information. This is based off of the iCalendar standard for event information, those ICS files that you may add to your calendar applications. Additionally, for HATOM, the microformat for syndicated content, it's based on the ATOM specification itself. And then additionally, microformats use other microformats, and they borrow from the naming conventions of one microformat into another, so it's a common vocabulary. Another one of the tenets of microformats is that they're supposed to be simple. The reason they're supposed to be simple is that they're supposed to be easy to learn and use, so that once you get it, you just can start adding it to your markup without having to do anything in terms of a huge learning curve. They're also based on current human behavior on the web. And that means that, we're already publishing contact information. We're already publishing events. We're already publishing reviews of books and restaurants and such. So they're intending to describe the stuff we're already doing. We're already putting the content out there, so now we want to describe it. And it's aimed at 80% of this content. It's not that 20%. Let's say you work for like a national laboratory, and you have a lot of scientific terms and things that you want to describe and add meaning to. Well, that's going to be the 20% case that microformats aren't targeted at. Microformats instead want to focus on that common content like events and contact information. They're also supposed to address a specific problem. And when I refer to problem, it's not really a problem. I don't agree with the terminology that they use here, but it's really, is there common real-world content that needs to be described? So if you come up with a microformat and it's for a very narrow use case, it's probably not going to be relevant or approved as part of the microformats process. But in the case of the microformats we have now, we're describing people. We're describing organizations, events, blog posts, reviews, and tags. This is stuff that's already out there. Also, one of the main reasons for microformats is they emphasize semantics. And if you don't know what semantics are, it's really just meaning. Adding meaning to the content that we have on websites. Additionally, microformats should be published with semantic markup. Geeks like to call it POSH, plain old semantic HTML. And just to take a little detour to talk about POSH for a second, Here's an example, hopefully none of you guys are doing this today, but using table for layout. This is an example of a common set of navigation links. And the first example has it in a bunch of table cells. The second example has it in a div with a bunch of paragraphs. Neither of those situations accurately describe the content, but we have tags that will. For example, an unordered list, because a set of navigation links are really just a list of links. So put them in a list. Posh is really encouraging you to use your markup to describe your content. Chris Mills from Opera referred to it as self-describing content. So if you have a heading on your page, you use one of the heading tags, H1, H6, whichever one you prefer. If you have paragraphs, you want to use paragraphs tags, not divs. You also want to stay away from using too many divs and too many spans just to have hooks for presentational purposes, especially if there is an element out there that would better describe your content and serve as a hook for presentational purposes. And one of the other tenets of, back to microformats, one of the other tenets of microformats, and this is the big one in the community, is that they're designed for humans first and machines second. And what I mean by that is when you publish content with microformats, a human visiting your site sees the content. There's nothing obstructed from their view. There's nothing added to it that makes it more confusing. They can still get the core content they need. But the addition of the microformats adds invisible metadata for machines. Machines like search engines, browsers, assistive technologies, other user agents, and applications. So by adding the invisible metadata for machines, you're giving machines meaning, but you're keeping the content clean and ready for humans to consume. So you may be asking yourself why we want to do this. The main benefit is all of it is based in semantic markup. Semantic markup, regardless of the addition of microformats, is going to be more accessible, more portable, can tend to lead to lighter weight pages, and can also be a lot more efficient to develop, particularly within teams. And so by building your site with semantic markup and then adding microformats also enjoy all of these benefits. But the real powerful benefit is that machine readability I talked about. So when you go to a website and you're on the, maybe I had a blog post where I was talking about that I was going to be at MIX, and you can read it and you can say, oh, she's talking about an event, that's the date, that's the location, because your human brain can process that. A machine, like a search engine, for example, it doesn't know it's an event, it just knows it's some information. That information could be searched on, but it hasn't put it into any context. And so what microformats do is put it into context. They give the machine some meaning so that a machine knows that not only is that a bunch of words that a person could search on, but that's an actual event with a date, a name, and a location. And then once you provide those machines that extra additional information, the machines can then start working for you. Your content that once you've published it with microformats and then a machine can then understand it, a machine can then extract that content from your website, index it, search for it, cross-reference it, combine it with other data. Your website basically becomes an API that you can get the information from and reuse it in other ways. For example, if you use the HAtom microformat for a blog post, or your blog, which may have several posts on the front, you can then use that the HAtom microformat to generate your RSS feed. And your content's published once. Additionally, microformats, because we've given some machine readability to the content, there have been machines developed that allow users to have some better experiences. For example, HCard for contact information allows users to download contact information to their address books. Similarly, HCalendar for event information allows users to download those events to their calendar applications. Microformats are also leading to more meaningful search results and helping content on websites become more findable. Excuse me. So I would like to take a look at one of these machines that's actively using microformats. So let me go over here. All right, so Google's been really pushing the semantic web lately. The past 18 months or so, they've gone really insanely crazy with it in a very good way. They've introduced this new thing called Google Rich Snippets. Snippets are the things that you see on search results that have sort of a brief description in the link that you click. Well, what they've done is they're using microformats and other semantic technologies to get meaning from from your content, so that when they display it in search results, they can display the search results with a little bit more context, so that their users, the searchers, find information more readily that's more meaningful to them. So, for example, all right, so I do a search for San Francisco coffee. And you can see that the search result, it's number 3, it stands out a little bit more from the others. Do you see the star ratings next to it? Tells you how many reviews, what the price range would be. And that's because Yelp is publishing all of their reviews with the hreview microformat. Google, meanwhile, is indexing that information. It says, oh, this is a review. There's some extra goodness hidden in the microformat that I can then display to my users so that they can more easily find relevant search results for themselves. And this is just one example. This is hreview, but Google Search Rich Snippets is also using hcard and hcalendar. Oh, sorry. All right. So that's one way that microformats can help. And this is one of the biggest consumers of microformats lately is Google these days. All right. Okay, back to the benefits. As I already sort of alluded to, microformats are really easy to learn, and that means there's no real investment except a little bit of your time to start publishing with them. You don't need any special software. Whatever you're using to edit your HTML is what you can use now, and you don't have to really learn anything new. You understand the concept of using attributes and values. And then finally, microformats encourages standards. And when I'm talking about standards, I'm not just referring to web standards, which is valid semantic markup. I'm also referring to standards for development teams. Before I went freelance, this was something that my team used to decide upon what our vocabulary would be for class naming. It also, because we were using Posh, gave us the standards that we would use for markup. And so it definitely encourages standards within the team that then translates to efficiencies for development. There are currently over 6 billion microformats published online today. And when I say over, I don't really know exactly how many over, because this is the last number I was able to get from Yahoo Search Monkey before it stopped working. But since this number, several new major sites have started adding microformats. In fact, 3 weeks ago, Facebook started adding the hcalendar microformat to all of its events. And so, you know, if my math is right, there's like a gazillion or something like that out there. And the kind of companies that are using it are companies that you're probably already doing business with in some fashion or another. XFN, which we'll take a look at, is very popular with social networks. Rel License, naturally, it makes sense for Creative Commons to use it since they do licensing. hcard, as I mentioned, is supported by Google Rich Snippets as well as many social networks. hcalendar is pretty much available on most any event-based social network or site. Every single resume on LinkedIn is published with hresume. So if you have a resume on LinkedIn, you are actually already using a microformat. hreview, as we just saw, is in Google Rich Snippets. hrecipe, this was just recently, Google announced this really cool recipe search. And so maybe you've gone to Epicurious or these other sites to get recipes. Well, now Google is indexing recipes on the web that are marked up with the hrecipe microformat and putting it all into a singular search that you can choose based on like how many people you want to serve, how long it takes to cook. And this is from, if you're blogging about recipes and you're using hrecipe, it's going to be incorporated. It's not just the major sites. So there's a lot of incentive to use it, especially as you can see other people using it in different fashions. So I've talked about the benefits and the basics. And if you find those things interesting, you're going to want to start adding microformats to your websites. And so, and I refer to that as publishing microformats. So we're going to start looking at a couple examples, starting with the elemental microformats. There are two categories of microformats. We've got elemental and compound. The elemental microformats are a single attribute value pair, just like the rel tag that we just looked at. And they're often used as the foundation for other microformats. So let's look at that rel tag again. So by adding the rel attribute with the tag value, I'm basically saying that this hyperlink goes to a page that talks about what the current page is about, or part of the current page is about. It says it's a tag. How this may be useful, I'm going to demonstrate a browser plugin for Firefox that allows you to have a contextual search based on tags. So let me just bounce over to the, yeah, okay. So here's a blog post that I put up saying that I was going to be at MIX. And right down here on the bottom are tags, just like you may have on your own blog or you might have seen on another blog. But what I've installed is a plugin for Firefox called Operator. And you can see that it gives me some options up here at the top. One of them being tag spaces. That's because it recognizes all of the tags on my blog post because I've assigned them rel tag, and it gives me for each one of those tags a contextual search. So maybe Las Vegas is one and I want to find photos on Flickr. So this is something that someone has developed a plugin for a browser that you can install and that can consume your microformats. It also does other things. As you can see, it identifies events and contacts. But that was just one example of the rel tag microformat. Okay. Alrighty, so the next elemental microformat I want to talk about is rel me. This is basically the same concept as rel tag. Instead of tag being the value, we're using me as the value. And it is applied to links that represent you online. For example, this is a link to my blog, and so I've added the rel me microformat. What this does is allows you to have identity consolidation. And what I mean by that is, let's say I have a link on my blog to my portfolio, and then a link on my portfolio to my blog. And both of those links have rel me. Basically, I've then established a connection that says these two sites represent who I am online. And let's say I link to my Google profile. Well, as it just so happens, when I add a link to my blog on my Google profile, Google adds rel me. And so does Twitter, and so does Last.fm, and so does Flickr. And all of these reciprocal rel me links basically say all of these sites, all of these profiles represent who I am online. This concept of identity consolidation, I'd like to show you with a demo from a guy named Glenn Jones. It's called Ident Engine. And let me bounce over. Okay, so basically what Glenn has done, he's created a JavaScript library that utilizes the Google Social Graph API. The Google Social Graph API actually indexes these sorts of things like the rel me links, looking for these connections of sites that represent who you are online. And so all I have to do is enter a web address of any site that has this rel me link on it. And as long as I have other sites out there that also have a rel me link and point to Twitter, and hopefully the connection will be good. What it's going to do, it's going to pull up a list of all of the profiles that it can find based upon my Twitter page having the rel me link, and the fact that my Twitter page links to my blog links to Twitter, my blog also links to my Google profile and friend feed and all these other places. And so while we wait for this to pop up, where this might come in handy is if you consider when you set up an account with a new social network. How often do you have to enter all your elsewhere links in? You got to say where you are on Twitter and what your Facebook is, what your LinkedIn is. The Social Graph API, which Ident Engine uses, can actually generate those for you so that if the person creates an account using a website URL that has rel me on it, it can then identify what other elsewhere links there might be. Let me refresh this page. Well, instead of waiting for this to go, I'm just going to show you the screenshot again. So you can just see When I did this earlier to do the screenshot, it came up with my Bright Kite, Delicious, Dig, Facebook, Flickr, Friend Feed, Google, and so on and so on. And so this could be integrated into a new account setup process if you cared to. As it turns out, me is just one of the values of the XFN microformat. This also uses the rel attribute, but instead of using the me value to say that this page is about you, it would be for links to other people that you know online. If you're writing a blog post and you mention someone and perhaps you put a link to their site, or maybe you might still have a blog roll or something like that, you can add different values to describe your relationship to that person. So here are some of the values. We have friendship values. You choose from one of the three, and they're listed in order of increasing intimacy. Contact would really be maybe someone that you know on Twitter, and that's about it. Acquaintance would be someone that you've met and you maybe know casually, and then a friend would be someone you know pretty well, pretty intimately. Professional, can you have one or both values? You have colleague or coworker. Coworker is someone you actively work with in a job, whereas a colleague might be someone you just happen to be in it, like we're all colleagues. Family, you have to pick one value. Kin, spouse, child, parent, sibling. When it comes to relationships that are dealing with adoptive children or step-parents, the roles are still the same, child, parent. Romantic, you can have any or all of these values. We have muse, crush, date, and sweetheart. The one that I do want to point out here, muse, it's referring to romantic in terms of it's not literally irrational, it's romantic, and so it's someone that really inspires you. So it's not someone you're going to take out on a date necessarily. It's probably someone who just, you like their work, you like what they do. Physical, there's a single value. You've either met someone or you haven't met them. Finally, we also have geographic, and you can have one value. It's either a neighbor or a co-resident. Yes? The scenarios where you want to use multiple values, they're space delimited. Yep. And then finally, as we already talked about, we have the me, the identity. And when it comes to using me, you only use me. You wouldn't use me and met because, yeah, you've met yourself, but that's just sort of obvious. And so putting this in terms of a real example, this is my friend Christopher Schmidt. I might have a link to him on a blog post. I've met him. He's my friend. He's my colleague, and he inspires me, so I also call him a muse. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into compound microformats, which instead of a single attribute value pair, you're using many attribute value pairs. And they also utilize other microformats as building blocks. The first one we're going to look at is the H-card microformat for contact information. As I already mentioned, contact information with H-card can be downloaded into an electronic business card. And what I have listed here are several different tools that will do that for you. We're going to look at one right now called Oomph. And Oomph is pretty cool. I have it installed on my About page right now. And as you can see, up here in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little icon. And when I click that, I get a little overlay. And what it does is it extracts the H-card information from my page, and then also gives me links to export it to Outlook, export it to Apple, export it to Yahoo. And what's really, really cool about Oomph is that this is browser independent. This is basically a jQuery overlay you add to your site. It doesn't require the user to install any special plugins or use any browser or any special technology. They simply visit your site. They see the icon. If they choose to click it, they can, and they get different functionality. This, incidentally, was developed by the folks at MIX11, the online counterpart, I guess, to this conference. It also comes with many, many, many more features than this jQuery overlay, but this happens to be my favorite tool. And this is something that I wish there were more of. It doesn't require anyone to download or install anything special. They visit the website and it's immediately available to them. All right. So maybe now you want to publish H-card. So I always take 3 steps when I start dealing with compound microformats. I make sure I actually have the content for the microformat. Then I mark it up with good semantic markup, and then I add the H-card values. So in this case, a simple example of maybe my contact information, my name, my company name, city, state, zip code, and my email address. Next, I decide to mark it up with some good markup. In this case, I chose to use a definition list. This is simply my preference for this example. Microformats do not care what markup you use. It does encourage you to use semantic and valid markup, but the microformats are independent of the markup in terms of how machines parse them. So once I have my good markup in place, then I think about the different H-card values that I may apply. In this example, I have my first and last name, I have a website, address, city, state, zip, and email, and then these are the corresponding values that I would use to describe that content. FN for your name, URL for the website, ADR for address, and then you notice I've sort of indented locality, region, and postal code. That's because those are children properties of ADR. So they're going to be nested inside whatever's assigned to ADR. And then finally, email. And then all microformats have a root value, a root class that has to be applied that basically says, hey machine, you're about to read some contact information. In this case, the root is vcard. And so the root vcard gets applied to the parent element that contains all of the contact information that you care to describe. In this case, that's the DL. Next, I move on and I add the FN class to describe my name. I added a URL for my business, and I added that class URL to say that this is my business. And then I say, I'm getting ready to describe the address information here, and then specify my locality for my city of Albuquerque, my region for my state of New Mexico, and my postal code for my zip code. And then last but not least, my email address. These are only some of the attributes, values that are available in H-card. You can have photo, birthday, job title. The list is pretty extensive. Use what you have content for. If you don't have phone numbers listed, you're not going to use those microformat properties. As I mentioned, your markup doesn't matter. Just make sure it's posh. Your attribute values are case sensitive here, so all of those that I showed in lowercase, they have to be written in lowercase. Your root properties can't be combined with sub-properties, so that vcard root property I mentioned, you wouldn't also add FN to it. The root has to stay independent of the rest. It needs to be the parent. Yes? I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Yes, you can absolutely put styling classes alongside your microformats classes. But what I suggest you think about if you're going to start using microformats is why don't you use those classes for your styling? Because they're semantic and stylish. So you don't have to throw in extra classes unless you really need them for presentational purposes. But that's what I do now. I use microformat class values for my styling as well. Yes? No, they're very specific in terms of how each microformat is configured. So there would not be a rel vcard. Vcard is always applied via the class attribute. Okay, so moving on to another compound. This is H-calendar. I've mentioned it a couple times. This is the microformat for event information. And just like the H-card microformat, this can allow machines to extract the information from your site and allow people to download the event to their calendar applications. And again, this is a list of many different tools that will do that for you. What I'd like to take a look at is a tool from Brian Suda called H2VX that will do this extracting the H-calendar for you. And alrighty. So basically, it's an event conversion service that you enter a URL that has H-calendar on it. And then if you choose the download button, it'll download the ICS file directly to your website, at which point, your desktop, at which point you can save it to your calendar application. But what's particularly nice is that it also generates for you the HTML is if perhaps you want to offer this as a link on your own website, that you want to give your users the opportunity to click the link directly from maybe an article about an event, and it downloads it straight to their file. And even better, it'll allow that person to subscribe to that event so that if there are updates made to your page, that those updates will also go through. H2VX does this for events and contacts as well, if you want to check it out. Alrighty, so let's take a look at HCalendar. Again, same steps. Do you have a content for HCalendar? If you do, then you mark it up with good semantic HTML, and then you add your HCalendar. So let's just talk about the event that we're all at this today, MIX. And I'm first going to mark it up with good semantic markup. As you can see in this case, I chose a combination of different elements. The last example, I used a definition list. Here I'm using an H1, a paragraph, and an unordered list. That's, again, to just reemphasize that microformats don't really care about what elements you're using, just as long as they're semantic and valid. And then I'm going to think about the different HCalendar class values that I can add to my content to describe what I have. Now, in that example, I had an event name, a website, description, start date, end date, and then a location. And so the corresponding HCalendar class values are summary for event name, URL for website. If you recall, that's the same property that we used for the URL in HCard. Description, DT start is the start date, and DT end is the end date. And then finally, location for the location. Once again, HCalendar, just like HCard and just like all of the compound microformats, has a root class value that has to be applied to all content, the parent element that contains all content about the event. And in this case, it's v-event. So, because I had a series of independent elements, I need to create that parent element on which to apply my root hook. So in this case, I chose a div, and I gave it the class event. And then I move on to the other properties. So I'm going to add class summary to my H1 because that contains the name of my event. To the link to the website for the event, I'm going to add URL. To the paragraph that contains the description of the content, I'm adding class equals description. And then for my start date, I add DT start. For my end date, DT end. And lastly, location. And it's, yes? Okay, what he asked is if you had a description that spanned multiple paragraphs, would you add the class description to each paragraph? And the answer is no. You would need to apply it to a div, for example, or maybe whatever made semantic sense for your situation. So you want to contain the entire description in a single instance of class description. All right, so one of the really cool things about microformats is you can combine them. Where you have content that is relevant to more than one microformat, you can absolutely publish more than one microformat. So, for example, the HCard that we looked at earlier, which was me, with our vcard, FN, URL, because I have a link to one of my own websites in there, I can add the rel me microformat. Similarly, with the HCalendar example that we looked at, I referred to Mandalay Bay. Well, Mandalay Bay has contact information about it, so I can also add HCard to that. The main difference that you'll notice that when we're not talking about people with HCard, but instead organizations or named places, that you add the org attribute next to FN. FN, remember, is the name. Org specifies that this is an organization or a place. And then the rest of it continues through. Now, what HTML5 brings to the table in terms of microformats is that we have a bunch of new semantic elements to describe our content and the structure of our pages. Section, header, footer, nav, aside, article. And there's really nothing different when you're using these elements versus the ones that you might have been using before you started getting into HTML5. You can still apply microformat class values to these elements, and the parsers that are out there that read and consume microformats can still read them off of these elements. This wasn't the case about 6-7 months ago. But they've all caught up since then, that they're now recognizing these new elements and can read the data from them. What HTML5 really does bring to the table, it changes things a bit, is microdata. Microdata basically has the same goal that Microformats does, is to describe our content so that machines have more context about our content. So let's take, for example, a smaller version of my H card, which is me and my city and state. If I want to add microdata to it, it's essentially the same concept. It's just a lot more stuff. So in this case, it's using the item scope, item type, and item prop attributes that are introduced into HTML5. These are completely valid. And if you look closely, it's sort of doing the same name. If you look at the DT, you see item prop equals name. That's telling it that it's name, and item prop is URL. The other things, item type is describing the specific vocabulary that I should be referencing. Personally, I find this to be somewhat more complicated than Microformats. As you can see, it's already more stuff you have to type. But additionally, class is something that everyone's already using and already comfortable with. This requires several attributes, not just one. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's new, and I still don't quite know how I feel about it, other than it just looks like a lot of extra work based on what I'm already doing. Fortunately, though, yes?
On the comparable data list, when you write item scope, doesn't that kind of break the XML?
Doesn't it break the what? This is utilizing HTML5, so it's not utilizing that sort of vocabulary that you're referring to, like with RDFA? No? Oh, no. This is, well, with HTML5, you don't always have to have, you can have Boolean attributes, which means that they just stand on their own like this. There isn't an equal quote value. Okay, so fortunately, if you have to start using microdata, maybe it's some sort of directive from up above, or maybe you're just curious about it, go ahead and do it. Just keep in mind there aren't a lot of tools that are parsing this right now. The one main exception, and it's a big exception, is that Google Rich Snippets reads this, just like it reads Microformats, just like it reads RDFA. But if you want to take advantage of some of the tools I showed you, like the downloading of the business card from Oomph or the browser plugins, you're going to also have to have Microformats. And fortunately, you can have both together. Now, this is a hot mess, and I would never do this to my markup. But you can if you have to. It's really about choice and you thinking about what your goals are, and also, are you working in a team? What's going to be easier for your team to pick up and start using? I will say that once you get started with Microformats, it's not a huge stretch to then move to microdata or even RDFA. It gets you in a semantic mindset, and that's really the goal. It's for you to think about describing your content more. So while I wouldn't do this, you totally can do it. They're both achieving the same goal of describing your content. So, yes? Microformats aren't going to have any conflicts if you're using other classes alongside them. So let's say in the HCard example, if I had my root class of VCard, I could also have maybe a class called, I don't know, I'm drawing a blank, contact. And it will still read the VCard and recognize it, and contact's not going to interfere with it. But as I was saying, oh, yes, yeah, if you are already using something called vcard, or mostly the root element is what you need to be concerned about, because if you don't have the root element, you can have all the other ones, and it's not going to trigger saying, hey, there's a microformat here. So yeah, you could potentially have conflicts if you're using HCard or vcard or vEvent somewhere else in your markup as class values. So getting started, I'd like to make a few suggestions. If I've interested you or inspired you to start doing something with Microformats, you can start doing something very simple. If you have a website, a portfolio, a blog, you can add rel.me to any links that you have to any of your social network profiles. You can also add HCard to the contact information that may appear on your site. You could do the same for your clients. If you have a blog, you could use HAtom to mark up your blog posts. If you blog about recipes, use HRecipe so you show up in that Google recipe search. Before you do any of those things, though, you might need some resources. My book, I've heard it's pretty good, so you could check that out. I also wrote a number of blog tutorials that sort of served as the basis for the book. So they're all online and free. I talk about the most common microformats that I had been using up at that point. That include rel tag that we looked at, XFN that we also looked at, hcard, hcalendar, hatom, hresume, and then I talk about some of the issues that I think the microformats community faces. So those are all online. Lots of other people are into microformats too, and they do a lot of writing about them. One amazing resource is the Microformats Wiki. This is a huge knowledge base of lots of examples, lists of demos, lists of places where you can find microformats in action. It's where they're discussing the future of microformats and where things will go. The only thing I want to mention to you is that if you are just getting started with microformats, the wiki isn't a good place to find good markup. Their examples are crap. They have tons of divs and tons of spans, and it's very non-semantic, so it completely violates one of their own tenets. But they're in the process of cleaning up their examples, so I would just encourage you to not rely on their examples for markup, but do rely on it in terms of information. John Alsop also wrote a book several years ago about microformats. It's a little bit less practical than my book, more theoretical, but still good in its own vein. Microformatique is his website that he's put online that has a lot of that content from his book. You can follow Microformats on Twitter. They usually post major updates to draft microformats. They also post about when a new site has started incorporating microformats. And then finally, if you have questions about microformats, of course, you can always feel free to contact me, but they have a Twitter account that you can send to microformateers, and there are people who are very intimate with microformats that will respond very, very quickly to you. And these are it could be Tontek Chelik who's responding to your questions, so you know you're getting quality information. I happen to be a fan of hand coding, so I actually go in and I add class equals FN. But maybe you're not into that. There are some authoring tools out there for you. There's a hcard, hcalendar, hreview, and xfn creator. And Zeldman even came out with, like a year ago, a plugin for Dreamweaver that also supports, it creates microformats for you. Yes? Content, I do think Perch, it's a small content management system, supports microformats, but that's the only one that I'm currently aware of. Yes?
Are there any microformats that link, let's say a company has 3 different websites and each of the websites link to the other ones?
So you're kind of wondering about the identity consolidation, not for a person, but for an organization? Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I don't think I'm supposed to say this because I think it sort of violates the principle of the XFN, because XFN is used to describe human relationships online. But if you apply rel me to all of those links and make sure they're reciprocal, it will still get picked up by the Google Social Graph API. So yes, you can achieve that. I just think it sort of violates it because it's an organization. But if that's what my boss wanted me to do, I'm not going to have any problems doing it. I just won't tell Tontek about it. Okay, so those are authoring tools. I do have one caveat to say about authoring tools. Some of these haven't been updated in a while, and kind of like the wiki, they generate like divs and spans out the wazoo, and it's just the most horrid markup I've ever seen. But it does give you those core class values that you can then extract from and then apply to your own markup. So use them with some caution. And then finally, I've mentioned all of these already in the earlier part of the presentation, but I just want to reiterate them again. All of these tools are currently available that consume microformats. They parse the information on the page and extract them and perform some sort of behavior. We looked at H2VX. We looked at the operator add-on for Firefox, the oomph microformats toolkit. There are other extensions for other browsers. The second one I do want to particularly point out, the Optimus Microformats Transformer, that has a validator. So if you've added a microformat to your page and you want to make sure you did it right, you can run it through this and it will tell you if you did it right or what you forgot to include, because there are certain class values that are required. And then I just want to encourage you all, if you're interested in learning more about microformats and semantic markup, even the role of HTML5 with semantic technologies, there's some additional reading. Some of this stuff is from me, but some of this stuff is from other people. And again, it's all listed on that one URL that I listed, which is right there. And again, for those of you who might have can't come in early, that's FJ0 BPW. And so now you guys have already asked a few questions. Are there any others? If you could come up to the mic so I could hear you, that would be great. Oh, hold on a second. I don't know if that's on. Can you speak up again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So earlier you covered that by standardizing the data, it makes it more portable. That's great for things like events and people, but in some cases, the client might not want their data to be portable or ingestible by other robots, right?
Mm-hmm.
And could you speak to how to sell adoption of this when they may not want their data to be consumed by others?
Right. Well, do they want their data to be consumed by search engines?
I was going to say, outside of SEO, is there any, are there any other selling points, do you think?
Any other what? I'm sorry?
Any other selling points outside of SEO, perhaps?
Oh, you mean to encourage them to utilize
Right.
it?
How do you
Well,
encourage
if they don't want their content to be extracted, I don't know how you convince them otherwise, other than showing them some of these demos, like showing them how you can download business cards. So, for example, my former employer, they had, like the CEO and the head honchos have their like special about bios. And then we just put little Rolodex icons and said, hey, download this to your address book and you can contact our CEO. Doesn't that make you feel special? But you really have to show them the tools that consume the information. But to be honest with you, in my experience, the SEO thing almost gets my clients every time because they're constantly trying to be found. They're constantly trying to make sure their content is found. And this is one way you can help do that.
Okay, thanks.
You want a book?
Sure.
Come on down. Anybody else? Okay, well, oh yes. The question was, are there any browsers that are currently consuming microformats natively? And the answer is yes, but it's kind of a half-ass yes. So Opera recognizes one microformat called rel home natively, and it's used to assist in navigation, and that's it. Most people don't know about it because you actively have to turn on the toolbar to see it. Firefox reads microformats and it's accessible from the API, the DOM. I'm not a developer, so I get all the terminology mixed up, but it's not doing anything with it yet. And it's one of those things that people seem to talk a lot about, like, wouldn't it be great to have native support in browsers? And I agree, it would be. We just aren't there yet. And I don't know what the incentive is yet for them to get to that place. So yes, but it's so small, it's almost negligible to mention. Would you like a book?
Okay, one of the first things that you mentioned was that one of the benefits of doing this was accessibility in terms of making the data accessible to a search engine, but you didn't really talk about accessibility in terms of like partial site or like voice readers and so on, in terms of making the data accessible that way. I guess there's no necessarily a benefit there? Or?
Microformats don't add any additional accessibility in terms of assistive technologies at this point. What they have done, there were some issues historically about a year ago that forced some changes of how we define date information, for example. So they do try and make sure that the content is still accessible, doesn't cause any problems for screen readers or assistive technologies, but it isn't doing anything to elevate that experience any further. Did that address your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Great. I'm out of books. Sorry, I only had 2. I'm sorry. Yes?
Do you have any message to the developers of content management systems? I guess
Yeah, well, I would really like to see a lot more support for the consumption of microformats, not only to make it easier for, especially if someone's using a content management system, they don't, typically, they don't tend, not the developer who's setting it up, but the client you're handing it over to, they don't typically have the knowledge to work with HTML and CSS and such. So if you give them a tool that allows them to add that more efficiently and user-friendly fashion, then that's good. But even more so, I would like to see more tools, not just content management systems, but more tools built to consume microformats so that you can deliver more positive experiences to your users. So that it's not just you can download an address book. Maybe there's something you can do like add microformats to your whole site, scrape the whole site and create an employee directory from it, and it's all from your website. I mean, I don't know how to do that, but I'm hoping someone else does and is going to come up with a way to do that with utilizing microformats or any other semantic technology.
Do you know of anybody or any websites that are currently using the H-resume?
LinkedIn, Simply Resume, and I forget the third, but it's listed in my deck and I can look for you again. But yeah, LinkedIn, every single resume is on there, and so is Simply Hired.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry? I did not hear you at all. Oh, Stack Overflow. Yes, thank you very much.
I may have missed a few things I just got here. Are there any industry-specific microformats and microformats communities being formed? And are there any search engines that are optimizing for industry-specific microformats?
No, there tend not to be industry-specific microformats because, as I described at the beginning, it's aimed at like 80% of the common content that we find out there. So if you work in the medical industry, for example, the sort of content that you're going to be described is kind of niche. And microformats aren't targeting you. You're going to want to look to RDFA, potentially microdata for those sorts of purposes. Now, as far as search engines doing industry-specific searches, I don't see it as being that far off based on what I see Google doing with its recipe search. It just came out 2 weeks ago. I had no idea that was coming. And if you get a chance, just check it out from a user interface perspective. It's pretty sophisticated.
Two questions. One is, who is this they that actually determines what the microformat is? And does any of these changes actually affect the likelihood of it being found with a search engine, or does it just change how it's formatted once it's been found?
Okay, so the first question, the they. It's basically you guys if you want it to be. Right now there are a number of people who are just really into microformats, and what they do is they work on testing microformats, they suggest propose changes to it, they test and they talk and they blah, 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 and go through the process of making sure that a proposed microformat for a type of content meets all of the criteria, and then they publish the information about how to start publishing that content. And if you care to be involved in that community, you can. You just start getting involved on the Microformats wiki, and there are lots of areas where they have active tasks that need people to volunteer their time to resolve issues and come up with solutions. Now, your second question was, in terms of microformats assisting search engine, making your your content be found in a search engine, it's not going to boost you to the top of the SCRs. It is only going, at this point, only going to allow your snippet to stand out from the rest of the snippets. But it isn't going to guarantee you any sort of higher ranking. All right, anyone else? Great, well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'll be up here if you have any questions afterwards.